Okay, so I'm going to read for you a little part of from the sages, from the Talmud. It says like this: it was asked of Chachma, of wisdom. The attribute of wisdom was asked. Choite ma oinshe. What is the punishment for a sinner? Wisdom said, the one who sins should die. So it was asked of the Torah, a sinner, what should his punishment be? The Torah said to them, they bring a guilt offering and they will be forgiven. It was asked of Hashem, what should be of a sinner? And he said to them, he should do teshuvah and he will be forgiven. There's obviously this is a hypothetical conversation, but an interesting dynamic between us and Hashem, where wisdom, which means logic, pure, simple reason, if somebody transgresses, somebody messes up, then they suffer the consequence. That's logical. Torah, which is more than just logical, it's the system that Hashem put in place. It's the order, the way things are meant to be. Law and order from God's perspective. If somebody messes up, then where a sin offering is appropriate, you bring a sin offering. Where there's a guilt offering, you bring a guilt offering, and then there is atonement. In other words, follow the rules. You didn't follow the rules till now. Well, start now. Follow the rules. So this medrash that says, and then they asked Hashem. Then it was asked of Hashem, a sinner, what should be his punishment? And Hashem says, let him do tshuva, and he'll be forgiven. He'll receive atonement. Isn't asking the Torah the same as asking Hashem? What's the difference between asking the Torah and asking Hashem? And the answers are different, right? The Torah says, let him follow the rules, bring a guilt offering, bring the korban, the sacrifice that's necessary for that particular situation, and he'll receive atonement that way. Hashem doesn't say that, and Hashem's answer is, he should do teshuvah, let him return, and he'll be forgiven. What's the difference between God's answer directly from God versus God's answer, as it were, through Torah, where Torah has a different answer than God, so to speak? The answer is that there is a difference between when you approach Hashem through Torah versus when you approach Hashem directly. And the real meaning of this, or a real, an exciting way of understanding this, an optimistic and encouraging and empowering way of understanding this, is by looking at it through the lens of, or through the story of, Pesach Sheini, the second Pesach, which is tonight. Tonight and tomorrow is Pesach Sheini. So let's back up and discuss Pesach Sheini for a moment, and then we'll come back to this idea. What is Pesach Sheini? The second year that the Jewish people were in the desert, God commanded them to once again bring the Pesach sacrifice, which they were not obligated to. They brought the Pesach sacrifice in Egypt, in Mitzrayim, before they left. And then they were again going to start bringing the Pesach sacrifice every year after they come into the land of Israel. In the desert, in those 40 years in the desert, the one Pesach that they were commanded to bring the Korban Pesach was the second year in the desert. And the Torah tells us that God said to Moshe to tell the Jewish people to bring the Pesach sacrifice, and included all of the rules, which include the rule that someone who is uncircumcised cannot bring the Korban Pesach, someone who is impure by coming into contact with a dead body, for example, is forbidden from bringing the Korban Pesach. And they brought the Korban Pesach that year, that second year. Then the Torah says that there were a group of people that they were impure, and they could not bring the Korban Pesach. So they came to Moshe and they said, Lama nigara, why should we be left out? We want to bring the sacrifice also. And Moshe comes to God and says, what should I tell them? And Hashem says, they have a valid argument, a valid complaint. We'll give them a second chance on the 30th day after Pesach, which is the 14th day of the month of Iyar, which is tomorrow. And then they can perform the Pesach sacrifice again. Now, there are all kinds of questions that need to be asked about this story. The most obvious one is, many of the commentaries ask this, the Or HaChaim asks this very clearly and very strongly. He says, what was their problem? What were they asking? God said, this is the law. If you're tamei, and therefore you can't bring the Korban Pesach, you don't bring it. So they come to Moshe and they say, no, we want to bring it. We don't want to be left out. So the Or HaChaim says, what are they asking for? They're asking for God to change his Torah? They want a new Torah? What's their question? What about all the other mitzvahs that they don't like? Come and complain to Hashem that they don't like the rules of the mitzvahs. Where does this come from? And why would Moshe take it seriously? And why would Hashem acquiesce to their demand and give them a new law? It's a strange story. You can imagine them, a group of people coming to Hashem and saying, we don't like the law of not mixing wool and linen. We want to mix our wool and linen. Change that one. You can't imagine Hashem saying, oh, okay, you don't like that one, I'll change it. And here Hashem says, if you're tamei, don't bring the Korban Pesach. And they say, well, why shouldn't we want to be part of this also, change it. And Hashem says, okay, we'll change it. Like Groucho Marx says, these are my principles, and if you don't like them, I have others. So God says, this is the law. You don't like it? Okay, I'll come up with another one. It's a strange story. So, of course, the answer is that Pesach Sheini is teaching us that there's no such thing as you missed the boat, as it's too late. We're talking here about people who are tamei, not only by accident, but even if they failed to bring the Korban Pesach because they just didn't go through the purification process in time or whatever, it's their fault. Nevertheless, Hashem says, even so, if there's really a desire, then there's a second chance. But this idea that they come to Hashem and they say, we know what it says in the Torah. The law is that if I'm tamei on Pesach, on the day that I'm supposed to bring the Pesach sacrifice, I know the law is I don't bring the Korban Pesach. But I want to bring the Korban Pesach. I want to be part of your holiday, of your celebration, of the celebration of the holiday that connects you and me, God and the Jewish people. That's an example of going straight to God, not to the Torah. Going going over the head, going over the Torah's head and going straight to the author of the Torah, so to speak. And what that really teaches us, or what that really shows us, is that there is such thing as teshuvah that is stronger than Torah itself. Of course, we know this from Torah. So not that it's stronger than Torah, absolutely. It's stronger than the process, the system that Torah sets in place. the way to circumvent the system of checks and balances and do right versus do wrong and reward and punishment and all that, there's a way to circumvent all of that, and that is teshuvah. And what is teshuvah? Pardon me. Teshuvah means that there's a project that God set in place, make the world a holier place, bring God into this world, do these mitzvahs, don't violate these mitzvahs. But as we've spoken many times, there's something higher than that. What's higher than that is the essential relationship between us and Hashem. And you can circumvent, so to speak, the thou shalt and the thou shalt nots, and the reward for the good and the punishment for the mistakes, etc. All of that. You can rise above all that by going directly to the giver of the law. Which means that when you can tap into the essential relationship, the fact of the relationship itself, the fact that Hashem wants to have, God created the world in order to have a relationship with us. And the vehicle for that relationship is all of Torah, the mitzvahs, the prohibitions, the reward and punishment, etc. But if you can zero in on the essential core relationship, like we do, for example, on Yom Kippur at Ne'ilah, the Ne'ilah prayer on Yom Kippur really magnifies or shines a spotlight on this essential part of the relationship, where whether I did do the right thing or didn't do the right thing, we're past that. We're talking about us. We're talking about you and me. That's expressed in Pesach Sheini, where these people come to Hashem and they say, we want this relationship with you. And we know that the Torah says that if we're tamei on the day of the giving of the Pesach sacrifice, that we don't bring the sacrifice. We know that it says that, but we want to have the opportunity anyways. And Moshe hears this and he says, that's amazing. I can't handle that myself. Not because he didn't know the law, but because this is the kind of question, by the nature of the question, it's a question that has to be asked of Hashem directly. You're talking about an essential relationship. You don't want my response to this. Moshe represents Torah. So Moshe says, I'm not going to answer this for you. I'm going to go straight to God and get his reply. And God says, there's a second chance. So when it is asked of wisdom, of intellect, of chachma, someone who sins, what should their punishment be? The answer is, logic dictates that if somebody wrongs someone else, there are consequences. Torah says, similarly, there are consequences, and Torah puts in place certain corrective measures, like bringing the sacrifices. And both of those are true, but they don't speak to the essential relationship between us and Hashem. The essential relationship between us and Hashem is more real than the rules. The rules are a facilitation of the relationship, a method for implementing, but the relationship is the ultimate purpose. So aside from how that relates to us with regards to teshuvah, when we feel like we haven't done everything we could have for Hashem, or if I know that I failed in a certain aspect, then I look to the idea of Pesach Sheini, and it teaches me that it's not too late. I can always make it right. I just need to really, really genuinely want it. And if I really want it to be right, I can make it right. There's more to it than that. Because the story comes with more context. The story of the Pesach Sheini doesn't show up in Torah until 3 parshas into the book of Bamidbar. And chronologically, that's out of order. It's out of place because it happened earlier than that. The Talmud says that the reason the story of Pesach Sheini is kind of buried on page 3, so to speak, is because it's a little bit embarrassing. It highlights the shame of the Jewish people. What's the shame? The shame is that they didn't bring the Pesach sacrifice the year before, or they didn't bring the Korban Pesach the rest of the time that they were in the desert. But the obvious question is, why is that shameful? The mitzvah was to bring the Pesach sacrifice once they enter into the land of Israel. So where's the shame? So some commentaries say that the shame is that the fact that they were stuck in the desert for 40 years is highlighted by the fact that they couldn't bring the Pesach sacrifice for those 40 years, because had they not messed up and gotten stuck in the desert for 40 years, they would have been able to bring the Pesach sacrifice the very next year. So the fact that they didn't reminds them of their shame, of the mistake that they made. But it's hard to accept that answer alone, because the story says that it was the Korban Pesach itself that the Pesach Sheini, the story of Pesach Sheini that highlights their shame, not the story of the spies. Rather, the shame that the story of Pesach Sheini highlights is that why didn't they ask for it last year? The first year that they were in the desert, there was no Pesach sacrifice. And nobody came to God and said, we want to bring the Korban Pesach. Or the next 38 years, there was no Korban Pesach. And nobody came to God and said, hey, we want to bring the Korban Pesach. Why didn't they have that same determination and that same drive and that same genuine, sincere desire to connect to Hashem, to where they pushed for the opportunity to connect to Hashem, even though that opportunity didn't naturally or organically exist in Torah, just like it didn't for those people who were impure, and they pushed for it and they got it. In other words, the story of the Pesach Sheini highlights a different kind of shame, which is that they should have known that if you really, really want to connect to Hashem, you can. You can come to Hashem and say, I really genuinely, sincerely want this opportunity, and Hashem will acquiesce. And we know that from this story. So this story of the Pesach Sheini is an exciting story, and it's a compliment to us, and it's an amazing story about the relationship that we have with Hashem. But at the end of the day, it also points to something very sad, which is, what happened to all those years in the desert that they didn't bring the Korban Pesach? Why didn't they push for it? They didn't want it badly enough? That's sad. So to not highlight that little flaw, the flaw of not that they violated any law, God forbid, or that they did something wrong, just the flaw of, if you had wanted it deeply enough, and if you had meant it sincerely enough, you could have gotten it, and you didn't push for it. In other words, the fact that they didn't excel beyond the letter of the law, that little point of shame is what the Torah is protecting us from by burying the Pesach Sheini story in the 3rd parsha of the book of Bamidbar. So, besides for the shame, the question of whether we should have or shouldn't have in the desert, what it tells us more importantly and more urgently is about today. And perhaps this is what the Rebbe based his constant demand of us on. The Rebbe constantly persistently demanded of us that we complain and kick and scream and demand of Hashem to bring Mashiach. And you have to ask, what are you kicking and screaming for? You don't think God knows best? You don't think God knows when Mashiach should come? You don't think he has a plan? Take it easy, calm down, sit down, be quiet, be patient. Hashem will bring Mashiach when it's time. If nothing else, then from this story, you have very clear evidence that if you want it badly enough, you demand it strongly enough from Hashem and sincerely enough, you'll get it. You'll get it. So the Rebbe would demand of us that we storm the heavens and shout to Hashem, Ad Masa, how much longer are you going to make us wait in Golus? How much longer are you going to make us wait for Mashiach? And there are a number of even video recorded talks in the Rebbe where the Rebbe was very sharp, speaking to God, as it were, demanding and almost criticizing and taking God to task for not having yet brought Mashiach. So from the story of Pesach Sheini, what we have clearly is that on a personal level, we don't have to remain in our state of disconnection or disconnectedness from Hashem. We can demand of Hashem that he let us in to the relationship, so to speak, on a level that transcends my performance of mitzvah or the opposite, God forbid. And just parenthetically, obviously, I'm not suggesting that we don't have to do mitzvahs. But if you have that relationship so strong, if you have if you're really that sincerely desirous of that connection, then you will do the mitzvahs. That will come as a natural byproduct of that genuine desire for the relationship. So we're not worried about the mitzvah. What we're worried about is the personal connection, the personal attachment. That's what we're talking about. So on that personal level, there is that personal connection to Hashem that is available. And if we want it strongly enough and we ask for it strongly enough, we will get it. And then together with that, there's the cosmic or the global opportunity, the Jewish people-wide opportunity, which is we can bring Mashiach. We can make Mashiach happen. Of course, Mashiach coming will be the ultimate fulfillment of and realization of the depth of that relationship that we have with Hashem. If we want that relationship badly enough, we can demand it. And there's no commentary needed on that. It's literally a case of a matter of demanding it from Hashem. It's interesting that there's an amazing story. There's a song that has the song is Anima Amin Be'emunah Shlema, I believe with complete faith in the coming of Mashiach. That's the words come from Rambam's 13 Principles of Faith. There's a tune which was put to those words. Those words were put to a tune from, I believe it was the Mojitzer Hasidim. And the story is that there was a train going to Auschwitz, I believe, and they all knew that they were going to their death. And somebody started singing the song, and soon the whole car was singing the song. Everybody was singing it together, I believe, with complete faith in the coming of Mashiach. And although he may delay, nevertheless, I await his coming every day. And somehow, I don't remember the details of the story. I should look it up because it's really a good story. Somebody, I guess the one who introduced the song to everybody else on the train said, if anybody survives, make sure that this song gets to the outside world or gets to my Rebbe, something like that. Bottom line is that the song eventually reached the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and it became a song that the Rebbe adopted, and they would sing it often by the Rebbe. And the Rebbe sang it. The Rebbe sang it publicly. What's interesting about how the Rebbe sang it is that although the song is Ani Mamin Be'emunah Shalema, Bevias HaMashiach, I believe with complete faith in the coming of Mashiach. Ve'af al pi sheyisma meya, and although he may be delayed, he may tarry, im kol zeh ani mamin. Nevertheless, I believe. When the Rebbe would sing it, the Rebbe would sing the first half, Ani Mamin be'emunah shalema be'vias HaMashiach, I believe with complete faith in the coming of Mashiach. And then at the second fall of the song, the second part of the song, the Rebbe would circle back to Ani Mamin, Ani Mamin. He didn't say, and although he may tarry, nevertheless I will await his coming. The Rebbe wasn't gonna accept the fact, although it was traditional. The Rebbe felt that it's too late for that. We're too late in history to be saying, although he may tarry, nevertheless, I will await his coming every day. No, I want it now. No more delaying. We want it now. The Rebbe would sing that song with all of the intent and all the fervor, but would not say that second half, although he may be delayed. No more delays. Let's demand it now. Demand Mashiach now. And if we demand, the Rebbe said it very clearly, if we demand it sincerely enough, and if we desire it deeply enough, we will get it. And it stands to reason that the Rebbe based that, even halachically, on the story of Pesach Sheini. Story of Pesach Sheini means there's nothing we can't get from Hashem if we just mean it sincerely enough. There's no extent to which we can dive into this relationship with Hashem if we just have the right desire and the right sincerity. And Pesach Sheni is also kind of like the symbolic halfway point, although it's not exactly halfway, but it's the symbolic halfway point between Pesach and Shavuos, which is of course, the counting of the Omer. It's the continuum. It's the process that we go through to get from the energy and the mood of Pesach into the energy and the mood of Shavuos. And as we've spoken a number of times, that's highlighted by the fact that on Pesach, chametz, leavened bread, leavened foods, are completely forbidden, extremely forbidden, more so than regular non-kosher food. It's extremely problematic, right? We don't even want the slightest amount of chametz in the house. And that's why we go through that whole process of searching and cleaning, and we eat only matzah. No bread, only matzah. Shavuos comes 49 days later, and the sacrifice on Shavuos is specifically, by Torah's instruction, chametz. Has to be chametz. Pesach Sheni is that bridge, sort of the halfway point between Pesach and Shavuos, where we're still eating matzah. It is traditional to eat matzah on Pesach Sheni, even today, to kind of remind us, reminiscent of, when we would bring the Pesach Sheni on the 14th day of Iyar, 30 days after Pesach. But when you would bring the Pesach Sheni on the 30-day point after the first Pesach, because you couldn't bring it on the first Pesach, on the original Pesach, you had to bring the Pesach, the Korban Pesach, and you had to eat it with matzah, but there was no prohibition against having chametz in the home. You could have bread and matzah in the same meal. Which is kind of like it sounds like a compromise, but it's not. It's a stage in the growth along the path of Pesach till Shavuos. Where on Pesach, we have to completely set ourselves aside, our egos. We have to be completely selfless and egoless on Pesach. No chametz at all. Chametz, of course, is the ego, the inflated, risen bread, right? On Shavuos, you come into Shavuos with yourself, right? Torah is all about understanding and logic, and Pesach is all about humility and sacrifice. the process of going from where you need to be completely selfless and set your ego aside entirely to the point where you can enter into the relationship with Hashem and bring your ego with. You don't have to check your ego at the door like you do on Pesach. You do that through the counting of the Omer, where you refine your animal instincts, your animal soul, through all the various weeks that we go through and the process of the counting of the Omer. So it's not inaccurate to say that the bulk, the heavy lifting of the counting of the Omer is completed on the day of Pesach Sheini. Or Pesach Sheini represents the point where it's downhill from here. We've done the heavy lifting. And when you look at the Kabbalah of Pesach Sheini and the days, the Chesed Shebahod, the different attributes that each week counts corresponding to, that actually works out without getting into the details of that now. But Pesach Sheini, certainly Lag BaOmer, which is at the end of this week on Friday, but Pesach Sheini, which is the beginning, the beginning of the counting of the week of Hod, is also kind of a real milestone in the counting of the Omer, which is when we've corrected the primary core attributes: Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, Netzach. Those are the really core attributes, and once you've gotten that done, you're going to succeed with the rest of it. And you can rest assured you'll get to Shavuos, and you'll be able to come into Shavuos with your whole self, with your animal soul, with your ego. Only this time it'll be a healthy ego, one that recognizes its relevance only in the context of Hashem's plan. And that's Pesach Sheini. Pesach Sheini is when we first reintroduce the ego into our relationship with Hashem. In other words, we bring ourselves back into the picture. Pesach is when we set ourselves aside entirely. Pesach Sheini is when it's okay to have the bread with the matzah. In other words, like we learned in Tanya, when you're in this relationship with Hashem, which is a loving relationship, you have to identify the I, you have to identify the self in order to have love. You can't love without having a self. All you can have without a self is fear, is not even the fear, but the bittul, self-nullification. In order to want this relationship with Hashem deeply, so deeply that you can ask for a second chance, the Pesach Sheini, that whole story and how it relates to our asking for a second chance and our wanting to have a second chance in the relationship with Hashem and our desire to have Mashiach, all of that requires that we do bring ourselves into the picture, that we should want. We don't just say, I want Mashiach because we were told to say that. That's bittul. But it's also not as sincere as I want Mashiach because I really want Mashiach. I want Mashiach because I was told, I learned in Torah that when we go into exile, when we suffer in exile, Hashem suffers with us. So I'm one human being. My suffering is this much. But if Hashem is suffering with me and everything in Hashem is infinite, that means that if I want to try to imagine what God is experiencing in exile, I think about myself and my suffering and then multiply that by infinite. When I understand the spiritual suffering and also the physical suffering of the Jewish people, and I multiply that by infinite and understand that that's what God is experiencing, for his sake, I want Mashiach. Because I love him, because I care for him. So all in all, the Pesach, and then the Pesach Sheini with the help of the counting of the Omer, and the story behind Pesach Sheini, and all of this really does bring into focus the relationship that we have with Hashem and the access that we have to that relationship, even if it seems to be beyond us and above our pay grade, so to speak. It's not. It's not. It wasn't Moshe that invented Pesach Sheni. It was individual Jewish people who had been impure and came to God and said, we don't take no for an answer. We want to have a relationship. And we can do the same thing. And if we can do the same thing, we're obligated to do the same thing. We're obligated to do it for ourselves. We're obligated to do it for the sake of the Jewish people. We're obligated to do it for the sake of the whole world. And we're obligated to do it for God's sake. All of the above, we and the Jewish people and the world and God himself will all get benefit from our successfully demanding of Hashem that circumvent his system and not wait for the dates that he has designated, or if there's such thing, if we haven't already passed all those designated dates or whatever they might be, but that Hashem bring Mashiach now, and we can do that. We have that in our power. It's within our ability. From the story that we read or around Pesach Sheni, which is tonight and tomorrow. So this is really the time to do it. If on Pesach we celebrate the energy, the mood, the atmosphere of redemption, then on Pesach Sheni we celebrate the mood and the atmosphere and the energy of there's nothing that stands in the way of a sincere desire to connect to Hashem. And there's nothing that stands in the way of a sincere desire to connect to Hashem on the level of the way we will connect with him when Mashiach is here. May that be b'mehera b'yameinu, speedily, immediately, now, today, even before Pesach Sheni. And then we can actually bring the Korban Pesach. Mashiach comes today, then tomorrow we can all bring the Korban Pesach all together. It would be a wonderful thing if we could really find that desire in us and that longing in us. We all have it. We have to dig deep and find that longing in us and call out to Hashem in sincerity and say, enough with the hiding the face, enough with the exile. It's time that we have Mashiach. It is traditional to eat matzah, if possible, shmura matzah, on Pesach Sheni. So if you don't have some, you're welcome to stop by. I have some extra left over from Pesach, but if you don't, at least get some matzah from the store. But make sure, if you can, to eat some matzah tomorrow, anytime during the day tomorrow. Tomorrow being Monday, the 26th of April. Shavua Tov.